welcome to this month's episode of Relaunch My Life Radio. And it's been a little while since I've recorded a podcast, and I was actually expecting to record this many weeks ago. And it is a special episode this month to wrap up my year because I am sharing an insight into my experience traveling through Egypt. And I'm going to cover a few things about: did I feel safe? What was the experience like? Why I decided to go, but also some of the highlights of the temples that I went to. And on reflection, I realized that I have taken so long to record this podcast episode. In fact, I tried recording a podcast when I was still in Paris after I'd been to Egypt, and I listened back to it and it was just complete gibberish. I definitely was in the thick of trying to integrate such a massive experience. And so now, I suppose, having nearly a month since I've returned home, I have gathered my thoughts, but also I do want to have I suppose, a bit of a caveat to this episode that I think the other reason I've taken such a long time to record this is I wanted to do the experience justice, and I wanted to sum up in words something that for me on so many levels has been beyond words in terms of the experience, the growth, the transformation, the shifts, the recalibrations that I've had. And it's really funny because I actually intentionally didn't research a lot consciously about Egypt before going. I just felt like I knew all my life that I wanted to go there. And months ago, I redid my vision board for the year, and one of the things I put on my vision board was the pyramids. And then dear friends of ours, Steph and Tim, went to Egypt earlier this year, and it was almost like it just activated that even stronger for me. Paul and I restructured our entire year this year in our business around his 40th, in that we gave ourselves the end of the year off. Normally, the end of the year is quite a busy time for us, where we're teaching our biggest courses, our master practitioner training, which goes for several months, but we rejigged things this year, and we actually brought our master practitioner training forward a few months, which meant the whole end of the year was open. Now, for years, I've been watching this particular facilitator, Sarah Jane Perman, run her Egypt soul initiation journeys at the end of every year. And every single year for like the last 5 years, they have clashed with us teaching master practitioner, so I couldn't go. Except for this year, we had this space. And it's a funny thing when you create space, sometimes it allows opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to follow through with to present themselves. And so we had this space at the end of the year where potentially we were going to go traveling for Paul's 40th, and we still hadn't booked anything around sort of September. And so when I saw Sarah Jane advertise her 11/11 soul initiation into Egypt, I just knew with my whole body and being that this was something I wanted to go to. Luckily, after such a busy year, Paul did not feel like traveling at all, so he gave me his blessing to go without him, as I already shared in last month's episode of this podcast. So everything kind of fell into place for me to be a full body yes to go on this trip. And even though I had some beautiful friends and family members voice their concerns about how close Egypt is to Palestine and the Gaza Strip and everything that's going on over there, for some reason, I felt completely safe about my decision to travel from Australia to Egypt. So in this episode, I'm going to give you some of the highlights. And if you wanted to follow along on YouTube, I am also recording this podcast as a video, and I will be sharing some of the footage of my trip. So I definitely recommend clicking the link in this podcast if you want to watch the actual video on YouTube as well. Okay, so I want to start off by talking about, firstly, how it felt to be in Egypt. I landed into Cairo and had an overnight sleep at Cairo Airport, one of the hotels there, and then traveled the following day, where I met some of the other guests that were going on this trip, people who I'd never met before. I met a few of the other women that were going on the trip, and we flew from Cairo down to Aswan, which was where we were going to meet the group. And Aswan, really, what it felt like being at Aswan and the accommodation we had, which was on the banks of the Nile River, it is said to be the birthplace of the world. So this is like the body of water, supposedly, according to Egyptologists, that all water bodies started from. And whether you believe that or not, watching the water and the way the water moved, and I'll add some footage of it, the whirls and the swirls and the way this water moved was like nothing I had ever seen before. And honestly, so many aspects of this journey, what it felt like to be in Egypt was it felt like a different planet, but at the same time it felt like home, if that makes sense. And so that evening, the first night in Aswan, we met all of the other beautiful people from all around the world. We called our constellation, all these people that also had the call to be in Egypt at that time. And we were told that the following day we would be up at 4 a.m. to go to our first temple, our first initiation, which was the Priestess Island. And there's a lot of history around it. I'm not going to talk too much about the history because, again, all kind of history can be open to different interpretation, but it is said to be one of the islands that Isis found some of Osiris's body parts when his body parts were spread all over the universe. So we went to Priestess Island and we had this beautiful initiation at sunrise where we all got to walk through this gate, Priestess Gate, and step through the water of the Nile as the sun was rising. And it was such a beautiful way to start the journey. After that, we took a boat across to the Philae Isis temple. And what was so fascinating about this temple were two things that really stood out to me. Number one, just the enormity of it, but the fact that not only was it an enormous structure, but it had actually been relocated because the original location was going to get flooded because they changed some of the locks and the dams in the Nile River. And so rather than let this temple get flooded and ruined, I think it was UNESCO, actually supported Egypt in relocating the entire temple. Now think about the biggest jigsaw puzzle in the world, but with actual blocks, with hieroglyphs. They had to take it apart block by block, and then they had to relocate the temple block by block. And it is incredible how huge these sculptures and these temples and these buildings are, but also what was really beautiful about the trip and the journey and the facilitator that I went with was we really had the opportunity to notice what was shifting in our cells and our body in each of these temples. So rather than just get all the facts and the information, it was more about what's happening in my body and what am I actually experiencing while I'm here, and what are my codes and downloads, and what is the jigsaw puzzle piece for me, my soul, my being that is going through this temple. Now, one of the things that's really cool is that the temples were said to be kept alive by the humans, and it was humans doing practices and rituals and dancing, but you're not allowed to do that now. Obviously, you're not allowed to meditate when you go through these temples. The guards are very strict on watching what you're doing. They kind of keep an eye on you and make sure you're just a normal tourist. But the guards are also a little bit sneaky in that they will offer to take a photo with you, and then if you do take a photo with them, they will ask you for money. So I can imagine if you weren't prepared, some of the tourist traps, some of the kind of, I guess you could call them scams that happen, you really need to be aware, because there are people constantly trying to get your attention, trying to sell you things, trying to pattern interrupt you. Like I would walk past people and they would say, hey, come look at this, have you seen this? And it was a real pattern interrupt and an opportunity to see, well, are you focused on where you're going, or are you a tourist that's going to get easily lured into maybe spending lots of money that you didn't intend to? But aside from the guards that are watching you meditate, make sure you're not meditating and keeping an eye on things, one thing that was really cool was that every temple that we visited almost had its own little guards. And what I mean by that was the Philae Isis temple was just completely infiltrated with the most beautiful feline protectors. There were cats and kittens. There were such beautiful examples of this feminine feline energy through this temple, and the Philae Isis temple really was quite a sacred feminine energy, and for me I felt very soft and sacred and flowy and sensual, and it was a really beautiful temple in that way. And so each of the temples we went to kind of had a different energy and an intention, and it shifted something in me energetically depending on where I was going or what I really needed. And everyone in the group had a different temple that in a way changed them in the way that they needed on their part of their journey as well. That day then, after visiting the Philae Isis temple and the Priestess Gate, we then boarded what is called, and I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this properly, but Dahabeya, which is basically like a name for a fancy houseboat. So this was going to be our house, our home for the night, and I'll put some footage of that as well, because when I tell you this boat was next level. It felt so luxurious. I had a private room that I decided to invest in so I could have my own space, and it was so luxurious. It was enormous. And this is a wooden boat with beautiful tapestries, and we had our own private chef for the 5 nights, and it was just such a beautiful way to travel. And it was only our group that was on this houseboat, so it felt very sacred, and it was really beautiful because each day we got to do different embodiment and dance and body movement practices to help with the cellular activations of all the temples that we were going to. So the following day, we traveled up the Nile that day and then stayed docked overnight. And then the following day, we arrived at the next temple, which was called Komombo. And this temple was known as the kind of like the hospital for Egyptians. So they would go there for healing. There were crocodile pits. Crocodiles were said to be very sacred because they would lay their eggs along the banks of the Nile, and that would show where the floodwaters would get to. So it really helped the ancient Egyptians know what areas would be safe and what wouldn't. So the crocodile was very revered. But also, I think if we think about, hypnosis and the placebo effect, there was a crocodile pit where people who were really sick would be encouraged to go. And I thought, well, isn't that a great way to get rid of any hypochondriacs or any secondary gain people are getting? Because I don't think you could feel much better than avoiding going into a crocodile pit. I'm pretty sure you'd be like thinking, I'm fine now. Compared to that, I'll be okay, right? But what was really beautiful about the Komombo temple as well was it was really supported and held by the birds. There were birds everywhere living in this temple, and to me they kept the temple alive. One of my favorite parts of this temple were the hieroglyphs, and honestly all the temples had just insane hieroglyphs. I had been to the Egypt section at the Louvre and also New York museums, and of course in little old South Australia, and I'd always been fascinated by the Egypt sections and the hieroglyphs, but being surrounded in wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling hieroglyphs as far as the eye can see was so overwhelming. But what was beautiful was you really can't logically try to comprehend what all of the hieroglyphs mean, but knowing what I know about hypnosis and hypnotherapy and the nature of our subconscious mind is so symbolic. And so I just trusted that as I was walking through these beautiful temples, these ancient structures, my unconscious mind was drawing in and picking up whatever symbols I needed. And it was quite phenomenal. Like I had one particular place where I stood where I felt all of these things shifting in my womb space, in my solar plexus, in my heart. I could feel things in my body changing that my mind couldn't comprehend. And honestly, I think that's the easiest way I can sum up my experience in Egypt. I went in very intentionally to have shifts in my spiritual being, but also in my physical being, in my embodiment, in my presence, in my practice. And I really feel like each temple helped me experience my body as the temple, if that makes any sense. So that was a really beautiful highlight. I love the Komombo temple. It was really beautiful. And of course, at each temple and each day, I slowly got to know more and more members of the group. There were people, beautiful guests from all around the world, Portugal, Kenya, Brazil, people who live in Bali, like people just dotted all over the world. And it was a real gift to meet such beautiful, like-minded people. And each of the people on the trip, as you would know, I believe everyone is a mirror and everyone can teach us something. One of the first nights, what I did was I wrote down the names of each person that I'd met in the welcoming circle, and I wrote what I saw in them, like what I admired in them, the mirrors, the aspects of them, of myself that I could own and embody. And it was such a gift to be able to witness such beautiful expressions, especially of the feminine. Like there was just so many beautiful, strong women on this trip that really inspired me to see the different facets and aspects of myself as well. And so then the next day, we went to Karnak temple. And at this particular temple, there is a beautiful sculpture of Sekhmet, which is the lioness goddess, and real fierce, feline, feminine power, that real fire burning strength that we as women sometimes put out. It was such a beautiful temple, and huge temple with just incredible sculptures and structures, and of course hieroglyphs as well. So I loved the Karnak temple as well. It was very activating. And then the following day was really interesting. I didn't think I was going to share a lot on my social media while I traveled, but I felt really inspired to from the energy I was in Egypt. But I had this realization that if I share and this ignites one other person to go here and feel safe to go here, then that's such a gift that I want to pay forward. So rather than feeling like I was gloating about my travels, I thought, well, maybe this could inspire someone and help someone feel curious about what it's like to go through these lands. Because even me verbally explaining my experience is like a millionth of the essence. It is not the experience of physically being there and experiencing it yourself. So the following day was really interesting. I woke up in the middle of the night and I felt off. And actually what's really funny is just the day before I had described the feeling of being floating and sailing on the Nile in this dahabeah, going to these temples. I felt so present. And the best way I could describe it is that it felt like being on a medicine journey. And I've shared my experiences with plant medicine, with ayahuasca, etc. on this podcast, but it really felt like everything on this experience was Egypt as the mother, as the teacher, teaching me things, teaching me about myself, my shadows, my judgments, my darkness, the things that I want to see, the things that I don't want to see. Like there was just so many layers and levels to my learnings on this trip. And I had joked that I felt like I was on a medicine journey. Like I felt like I was in this constant altered state where I couldn't even access my brain, my conscious mind. I was just in this meditative, floaty, expansive, expanded awareness experience, which was aided by the fact that I didn't have to organize anything. And that was such a gift. I could really just fall back into my feminine and trust the facilitator, trust, okay, today I don't really know what we're doing, but it's going to be great and it's going to be exactly what I need. And so there was so much of that already brewing, but that next day I woke up and I felt off. And we'd heard rumblings about how sometimes people catch this thing called the Nile bug. The water is not drinkable, so you brush your teeth with bottled water, you drink bottled water constantly, but you know, there's always risks with how things are washed or if you catch something. But without going into too much detail, I purged from both sides, which was not enjoyable, and I was not feeling great. And I pondered, okay, well, do I go to a temple today if I'm feeling this terrible? And so I did something that I hadn't done with any other temples. I Googled the temple that we were due to look at that day, and it was the Hathor temple in Dendera. And the moment I Googled this temple, my entire body sat bolt upright and I said, I have to go. I have to go to this temple. Even if I feel on death's door, I'm going to this temple, because there was just something about the energy of this temple, and the columns in this temple at the very top have the Hathor goddess kind of carved into each column of these like 10, 20 meter high columns. They have these huge Hathor carvings, and I just knew that I needed to go. So I dragged myself out of bed and I felt pretty wonky. I borrowed some charcoal tablets and some electrolytes. I had brought some, but I'd gone through them already. And I dragged myself through the Hathor temple in Dendera. And it was honestly probably one of the most powerful, perhaps because I was in such an altered state. I was feeling so woozy. I just felt like I was in a dream. But this temple had a lot of energy around constellations. It had a really soft feminine energy. And in fact, the necklace that I'm wearing is symbolized by the Hathor goddess. And so it's an image of a head. It's meant to be a cow's head, and the ears have little ovaries coming out of the ears, and I'll put a picture on the YouTube video for you to see. But this was a beautiful temple, and I received a lot from it energetically. I felt a shift into the strength of my softness as a woman, if that makes sense. So this was really beautiful. We continued on, and I started to feel better the following day. And the next day we traveled into the Abydos temple and what is called the Osiron, and we had private access inside the Osiron, which is a floating, basically it's a floating building on the water above the water level, somehow these granite rocks are said to be floating. I'm not sure, I haven't looked into the engineering of it all, but I went along for it. And this temple was really beautiful as well. One of the other temples that we went to as well was a temple that was far out in the desert, which was said to be the father of Tutankhamun. And this temple looked much more subtle, like there were no tourists around, but that particular temple for me was one of the most powerful. And I asked our tour guide, why are there no tourists here? And he said, oh, the tourists don't like this temple because it's not big, so they don't think it's as important. But for us, we were having more of an experience of, well, what shifts in my energy when I'm at this particular grid point on the planet and on this particular place in the earth. Now, after Abydos, we traveled by bus several hours back to Luxor Airport. And when we got to Luxor Airport, we were told that our flight was delayed. And so we had, I think it was from memory, about 6 or 7 hours in Luxor Airport waiting to board our flight to Cairo. And it was fun. You know, some of the women on the group formed a conga line and played music through the airport. We just made the most of it. I bought a deck of Egyptian playing cards and played cards with some of the guests, and it was actually a really beautiful kind of pause. And sometimes when you're traveling, those unexpected moments where things don't go to plan are where life can sort of drop in. And so on the one hand, we could have perceived that as a negative experience, but you know me, I'm the reframing queen. I thought it was actually just really beautiful. And what was beautiful for me, as someone who has run retreats for nearly 10 years as well, was just witnessing the facilitator and how calm and graceful she was through it. Not once did she say, oh, I'm so sorry that this has happened, because you know what, everything was happening as it was meant to. And that kind of leadership was very restorative for me to witness. And I learned a lot through her leadership, which I'm very grateful for. So we finally, on the 10th of November, arrived late at night in Cairo Airport and traveled to Giza. And can I say, driving through Giza and witnessing the pyramids at night with the stars and the moon looking down on the pyramids was quite ethereal. It was quite a magical experience, and I'm really glad that we got there late at night, because it seemed like we were only allowed to see the pyramids in the daylight on the 11th of November. So that was really cool. We had a really early wake up the following morning, and we traveled by bus a very short distance to the Sphinx. And this would be, I would have to say, one of my highlights. The Sphinx, I don't know what it is, but I don't know whether it's because it's something I've seen for such a long time, but seeing the Sphinx and then the pyramids in the background and actually physically being somewhere that I wanted to travel for such a long time, and then feeling what it felt like and having it surpass my expectations. Like, I was very mindful to stay very balanced and calm and present and not set high expectations for anything, to just be present and just witness and notice what was happening. But I had tears immediately upon witnessing the Sphinx. And as the sun rose, we had the opportunity, we had private access for an hour at sunrise on the 11th of the 11th, which chef's kiss to our facilitator for arranging that. But just our group got to sit amongst the base of the Sphinx at her paws, between her paws. And I was sitting nestled right up in between her left side. And the moment I sat down, I dropped into meditation. We did as a group a few chants and tones, and then I just sat in stillness in meditation. And I did not want to move. Like, my entire body felt incredible sitting there. It felt like I was sitting on a charger if I were an iPhone, and my battery was getting charged. My mental, physical, emotional, spiritual batteries were just getting a level up sitting there. It was so beautiful. And so I did go to Egypt with the intention of getting more answers on my life path, but also my fertility journey. And so I asked the Sphinx a question. Sitting at the base of her paws, I said, am I meant to be a mother this lifetime? And the Sphinx replied to me, if you're meant to be a mother, you will be. And if you're not meant to be a mother, you won't be. And I just had two things happen in that moment. I laughed, like I chuckled, and I thought, well, of course, thank you. And then on the other hand, I felt almost like this weight drop off my shoulders, this weight of, will I, won't I, what's my journey, what's my path? You know, I've shared things about my fertility journey, and as much as I know I could take further steps to make it happen, for me, and I have no judgment on anyone whose path it is, but for me, my body is just a full body no to IVF. And that's been something that I've really had to come to terms with, because I have many dear people in my life that have gone through fertility journeys, gone through IVF, and they now have children. But for me, knowing that that's not my path, and that's not the path that Paul and I have chosen, has been a really important step in our relationship, in our honesty, in our connection, but also in honoring my body. And I think with anything in life, as long as we're true to us and our belief systems and our body, that's the most important thing. And that's been my learning through this whole fertility journey over the last 4 or 5 years now, is what feels right for me and what doesn't. And whilst I have this big heart and this huge maternal instinct, and yes, I would love the experience of being a mother this lifetime, I'm also acutely aware of the perfection of having the experience that I'm having of not being a mother this lifetime, and the equal levels of love and joy and pain and despair and grief and confusion that each path would bring me. You know, I am not under any fantasies or illusions that either path is easy. Both paths are challenging in their own way. And whilst I consciously desire to be a mother, I can also appreciate that there are unconscious desires for me not to be. And that's also why it's not happening. And so that was really powerful. Having that drop in for me was really healing, and it was a really potent part of my journey. And I had almost been like, oh, I've been in Egypt nearly 9-10 days now, and I haven't had any messages come through about my fertility. And then it was like, boom, at the base of the Sphinx. It all just was so simple and yet profound in that moment as well. So that was a very cool moment that I'm very grateful for. Then that evening, what an experience. We were given the incredible opportunity to have 2 hours of private access inside one of the biggest pyramid, inside the king's chamber. And so at 7 o'clock at night, under the moonlight, we journeyed towards the opening, the entrance of the king's chamber, where we were met by a guard. And he led us up this teeny tiny staircase where you have to stoop over and climb for about a minute. I'll put some footage in there for you. And we had to climb and climb and climb and climb, bend over all the way up inside the king's chamber. And this was about a maybe 4 by 6 meter room. And there was only one thing in this room. Well, there were a few things. There were fluorescent lights, there were humidifiers, and there was a granite sarcophagus. And our group were given 2 hours here with no interruptions, no one else there, for us to be able to meditate. And we did some vocal toning, which supports the meditation process. But the cool thing was, Sarah Jane organised with the guards to turn off the lights and the humidifiers, which added so much to the experience, because being there in the dark meant there was so much more I could see with my third eye. And the point where we were in the pyramid apparently is the exact same point if you cross map it over your mind or your brain, where the pineal gland is in your third eye. And so it is said that at points in this part of the temple, you can activate a DMT response as well. And so we did some vocal toning to support that. But one of the other people on our group, he had talked to me about the fact that there are grid points all over the world, and there's grid points of belief systems and structures and heavy consciousness, where above the pyramid, there's no grid points. And so I really went into my meditation in the King's Chamber wanting to explore that. And so I had some experiences of astral travel. I flew up above the pyramid. I sat on top of the pyramid and got to kind of see different dimensions. I won't go into too much detail because it was a very personal journey, but I can tell you that I felt like my entire body got completely turned inside out. Like every cell in my body was inverted, if that makes sense. It was like reset, recalibrated, and shifted through. It was a very masculine energy in the King's Chamber for me. Very penetrative energy. Like I felt like every cell was just getting like poked and prodded and shifted. I had a lot of connections with Paul, a lot of healing in my womb as well. But one of the things that I was allowed to do was climb inside the sarcophagus, which is this granite kind of box which is open that you can climb in front down into. And the echoes and the reverberations of the tone is even more potent and loud when you're in there. And when I lay in there, I had this visualization of just millions of Ankh symbols, the Egyptian symbol for eternal life, just falling down on my body. And it felt so rejuvenating and so healing for me to receive that. When I've talked about the animals that keep the temples alive as well, the dogs and the spirit of Anubis, which is one of the Egyptian gods with the dog head, the dogs around the pyramids were just so beautiful as well. And so I had a lot of that energy come through, as well as Max, who for me, he's laying on the couch next to me as I record this. He is just the epitome of a combination of the Sphinx and Anubis, and he's just such a wise little teacher. So it was really beautiful being inside that King's Chamber, and a lot of people had very profound experiences in there, which was really cool to be able to share. And it's funny, traveling to Egypt, I think it was on my bucket list, it was on my vision board. I thought, yes, I'll go there once and sort of tick it off the list. But having really deep dived as much as I have, but also knowing that I only scratched the surface of what temples there are in Egypt, having really had the experience I had, I can understand why people would go back, and even why people would return to the pyramids, the King's Chamber. There's different places within even that pyramid that we went in that we didn't get to go to. So we didn't go into the Queen's Chamber. There's also a part down the very bottom that has water in it apparently, but we just didn't have time to go to all those places because you have to obviously move a big group from section to section, and the pyramid is quite huge as well. They're huge. Like you can't even appreciate when you take a photo how big they are. Even at one point I looked at the pyramid and I thought from far distance away, oh, it's not that big. And then you notice that there's a 6 foot tall person standing, and that's the size of one of the blocks. And then as you keep looking up, there's, hundreds of blocks up above them. Apparently across all the pyramids, there are 2 million blocks of sandstone and granite. And so it's quite a lot to take in with your feeble brain, and so I sort of just defaulted to letting my spirit and my soul take it all in, and that felt much more manageable. But on the other hand, it's also probably why it's taken me so long to put this all into some sort of logical narrative for you to be able to share through. And this might be way too much information, but I think from my perspective, it's a really special thing to be able to share. And so many people have asked me questions and have been really curious. And so I just thought, well, there'll be something here for people, and you can always, skip parts if it is too much detail for you as well. So after Giza and Cairo, we then got in a bus and we started our journey to the Lemurian coast and our journey to Siwa, which is an oasis in the desert where Mark Antony used to go for respite and recharge. And it was a long journey, but it was part of the journey that I really wanted to take because I wanted to experience beyond the pyramids. I wanted to experience more of Egypt. And there were a couple of things that really stood out to me. The first was just how beautiful the water was. It was the Mediterranean water that we were putting our feet into when we got to the beach at the Lemurian coast. The top of Africa, which across the water would have been like Spain or Ibiza. And so it was really beautiful to feel how warm that Mediterranean water was and how clear and cleansing it was. And after all the time traveling and journeying through, it was really powerful to be in that ocean energy. And so then we drove to Siwa, and we had a few nights there where we got some incredible experiences. We drove at ridiculous speeds through the sand dunes of the Sahara Desert. We went to some different salt pools and healing pools. And then on the last day in Siwa, we had a bath ritual at the Cleopatra bath spring. And this is a natural spring where you actually can see the bubbles coming up from the base of the bath. And Sarah Jane did a little ritual with each of us before we had an opportunity to dive into that spring. And then we started our journey back. And I'm so grateful that I got to journey back but I didn't come all the way back to Australia. I had a flight the following day to France, and I flew to Paris. And if I can tell you that it was the most stark contrast imaginable, Egypt, a lot of Egypt to me, a lot of the towns we traveled through and even the places we went, there were a few things that stood out. It's very third world. Like you have to drink bottled water. There is a lot of poverty. There's a lot of people, not so much beggars, but just a lot of people trying to sell you things and make money. And there's, the quality of life there. There's a lot of dirt and rubbish, and that was quite confronting. And Cairo itself, there's 20 million people living there. All the buildings are covered in dirt and dust. And to have the contrast, and of course the culture in Egypt, contrast, and then flying into Paris, I just was gobsmacked at how clean the airport was and how organized and structured and beautiful everything was. It was things are just created for the purpose of beauty. It was such a contrast, and I had just a beautiful 6 nights in Paris. I had so many intentions to do so much writing, but I honestly was not drawn to my iPad or my computer at all. I just walked the streets, I people watched, I had obviously lots of almond croissants. I had a dear friend who traveled down from the Netherlands to stay for 3 nights at an Airbnb across the road from me, and so we got to go for dinner and go to markets together, and that was a really beautiful experience. So it was a really enriching experience in so many ways. And earlier this year, you would have maybe recollected me talking about doing the Artist's Way as part of my book club by Julia Cameron in my Birth Your Book Writers group. And one of the things she talks about is taking yourself on artist dates. And this is just going somewhere for the purpose of joy or inspiration. And that's really what I felt like. Honestly, all of Egypt and all of Paris was for me. It was just a month full of artists' dates where I just got so inspired, and I do feel so inspired. And now it's about coming home. How do I recalibrate that in a way that's really intentional? But even with recording this podcast, I know that the Juliet that I was before I went to Egypt would have forced myself to put my podcast out weeks ago, because that's when I said I would do it. And I suppose in coming home, what I notice about myself is more patience, more presence, and more willingness to take my time with things, which is a really nice feeling. It's different, because I think up till now, I mean, this whole year for Paul and myself and our business, it has been chock-a-block full. And now over Christmas, not having any courses that we're running, it's a really beautiful, special time to just notice what's there and be creative. And yeah, so it was really special. Now, one of the other questions that I got when I went live on the last day of being in Egypt was, did I feel safe while I was there? And I would say a couple of things. We had a big group, so yes, I felt safe. I generally, as a person, feel safe anyway. It takes a lot to make me feel unsafe, because I've done a lot of inner work on that. That was a pattern for me in my 20s, that I didn't feel safe, and so I would do things externally to try to make myself feel safe, but now I feel safe in my body as it is. But I felt really safe with the group. I felt really safe with Sarah Jane's leadership. And we did have a few moments where we had police escorts driving from Abydos back to Luxor, for example. And that for me was really interesting, because I felt so safe. I was more questioning, why do we need a police escort? Like, is there something I'm not aware of here? I'm not sure. There was one moment when we were driving through the Sahara Desert in these Land Cruisers that were literally going about 150 kilometers an hour, where I didn't feel totally safe. It was like being on a roller coaster that had no tracks. They were slipping and sliding all over the sand and getting jumps, like getting air in these Land Cruisers that to me are not meant to get air. That didn't feel totally safe, but when I expressed my concerns to the driver, he said, well, Libya is about 60 kilometers to the left. Would you rather go there? Would you feel more safe? And I thought, well, no, I feel safer in this car. It's okay. So that was a great reframe from him. But generally I felt safe. I am pretty well traveled. So I think a few of the women on the group felt a little hassled and harassed by the people on the streets and at the temples trying to sell things. But my sort of perspective was, sometimes in our Western cultures, we say no, but we might be smiling or laughing. And so the shopkeepers are like, oh, well, their body and their face is saying yes, so that's a yes. So you just have to say no, thank you, and actually mean it, and then they leave you alone. But that's, you know, also a lesson in life as well, is to be really clear with your no and your yes. It was absolutely such an incredible experience on so many levels. And what I've shared with you isn't everything, but so much of what I am now, I feel deeper levels of gratitude in my body. I feel much more connected to myself. I feel so grateful to Paul for his support. He took care of everything in our business while I was gone so that I could just really be there, and that's been really beautiful. And I know that I'd love to go back with him someday and show him those parts, but also explore some new parts as well. So I'm so grateful I went. I'm really grateful that I get the opportunity to just share some of the experience I had. And if you are thinking of going to Egypt, let me know, drop a comment. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments at juliet@relaunchmylife.com.au. And if you are thinking about going to Egypt, I can obviously highly recommend Sarah Jane Perman. I'll put her details on the YouTube notes as well. She's a beautiful facilitator. You will be so safe with her. And I hope that this has given you a bit of an insight into what is such a special place. Before I went, actually, I did do some research. I looked at some YouTube videos of people, especially women, traveling through Egypt. And I think a lot of people commented like, don't bother going, it's a horrible place, all of these different perspectives. But I think I always remember that saying of like, wherever you go, there you are. Like, travel is always going to show you. Everything in life is going to show you. So as you would know from listening to this podcast, I'm such a big believer on doing the inner work, like clear any doubts, any limiting beliefs, any things that you think could go wrong, like work on all of that stuff before you travel so that you are in the best place to travel. And I think that's a really important piece, but also, you know, just know that you'll have whatever experience you need to have, and whatever's happening is perfect, and travel definitely shows us that as well. So I feel so grateful. I suppose I feel as well more connected to the world. Every time I travel, I feel like I learn more about the world. And that's a really interesting piece for me to sort of finish on, is we all have a different model of the world. And the more places you travel to, the more you can kind of map, well, what is this world and this reality we live in? Because sometimes it's really easy to get stuck in that bubble and think that everyone is in this reality, in this model of the world. But traveling to me always expands my model of the world. It helps me, appreciate the world and the reality, but also how so much of the world live as well. And one of the biggest gifts as well was now I've got this beautiful constellation of people that I've met on this journey from all other places in the world, and I'd love to visit some of them along the way in the future as well. So thank you for tuning in to this month's episode of Relaunch My Life Radio. That is my final podcast for the year, and I am going to be releasing a podcast in the new year with some New Year's resolutions and some tips and tricks for goal setting in the new year. And I just really want to express my gratitude for you for tuning in, whether you have just started listening to my podcast or you have been along since the very beginning, 2017, I think it is now. Just thank you, because I never know who's listening. And every now and then I get an email or a message or a comment from someone that they listened to a podcast and how much it helped them. And there's also so many beautiful students in our community that you recommend particular podcasts to clients of yours. So whether you are a client, whether you've met me or not, I just really want to say thank you for tuning in and for being interested in what I am sharing with the world. When I started this podcast, I was the Relaunch My Life girl. I had written my book about how to reconnect to your soul, how to redesign your life and rediscover your magic. And it's been such a journey since then. And I know that this podcast has also evolved over the years. And it's a really beautiful platform for me to be able to express what's on my heart and mind. And I always try to share things that I think will inspire or help you to get more self-awareness or clarity on where you're at in your life. And so whilst I'm not sure if this podcast necessarily hit all of those buttons, I'm trusting that if you felt called to tune into this podcast, there was something that spoke to you. So from my heart to yours, I am just wishing you the most beautiful, happy new year. Thank you for being a part of my journey in 2024, and I hope to see you in 2025.